All right, guys, today we're going to do keto versus the potato hack part 1, the two magics. I teased this video last week. It is definitely a bigger topic than one video is going to be able to handle. Also, my friends tell me I should say something like smash that like button, like and subscribe if you like this video. It does help the channel. And without further ado, let's get into it. So I assume most people watching this video know what the keto diet is. In short, the idea is you limit carbohydrates to very small amounts, less than 10% of calories, until you enter something called ketosis, which is measured by the rise in what are called ketones in your blood. Many people have had success on a keto diet. I have lost 30 pounds or more at least 3 times in my life on a keto diet. And so there is a lot of evidence that a keto diet can help people lose weight. It doesn't work necessarily for everyone, but it has been shown to be a useful tool. Conversely, the potato hack was coined when this guy, Chris Voigt, ate nothing but potatoes. This was back around 2013 or so. Chris Voigt was an executive in the potato industry, and he wasn't trying to lose weight. He was just trying to show that potatoes were a healthy food that you could live off of. And he wound up losing 21 pounds in about 2 months, eating 2,200 calories of potatoes every day. It's funny how the timing on these things work. I teased the video Keto versus the Potato Hack Sunday morning when my video came out. Monday morning, my buddy sent me a link to Dr. McCullough's latest publication where he references Denise Minger's In Defense of Low Fat. I stole this chart from Denise's talk because I really like it. She's pointing out that these very low fat diets have some type of magic when it comes to weight loss and metabolic health, and that these keto diets up here, which are more than 65% of calories are from fat. So these are keto diets, and these work by some other type of magic. And in the middle, and this is perhaps my favorite part of this graph, is what she calls the macronutrient swampland. And the idea is that the most fattening diets are combining 30-40% of calories from fat with another 40% of calories from carbs and 20% protein. You wind up right in the middle, and this is the swampland, which is presumably not where you want to be. By the way, this is a very good video. I recommend it. She looks at a lot of the historical data of these very low-fat diets, which have been around since about the 1930s. I have a few caveats about her video. One of them is that the Kempner rice diet, where she shows miraculous weight loss, Kempner did a lot of studies with kidney disease, etc., feeding people white rice and sugar and fruit on an ad-lib diet. But the study with the amazing weight loss results is actually a quite calorically restricted diet. I think they said something like 400 to 800 calories a day of those same foods caused the miraculous weight loss that you'll see in her video. This is a recent study by John Speakman, sort of demonstrating the swampland principles. They put mice on all of these different diets. They altered the amount of sugar in the diet. The mice did not get fat on a high sugar diet. They did a low protein versus a high protein diet. The mice did not get lean on a high protein diet. But when they put the mice on a high fat diet that was up to about 50% or 60% of calories from fat, that was when the mice were the most fat, was 50% or 60% of calories from fat with still significant calories from carbohydrates. When they went all the way up to 80% of calories from fat, that's sort of a full ketogenic diet, the mice were leaner than the mice fed 60% fat, although not as lean as the control mice in that particular experiment. People wonder what types of fats they were using, and it says here the source of fat was a mix of cocoa butter, coconut oil, Manhattan oil, which is a type of fish oil, palm oil, and sunflower oil, which was designed to match the balance of monounsaturated, saturated, and polyunsaturated fats in the typical Western diet. And so they're trying to mimic essentially the standard American diet in these mice, just to show an experiment that shows that the potato hack style diet can actually work. This is an ad-lib diet. This was done in the early 80s. These guys are heart doctors. They were trying to show an effect on heart disease risk. It was not a weight loss diet. People were not told to reduce calories. I love the way that this is presented. They have 14 patients, and you can see the result in each patient. So this is like 14 case studies. The most significant result was that at the end of 12 12 months, the patients who had managed to maintain less than 20% of calories from fat, their average weights had gone from 186 pounds to 164 pounds. These are all men. Obviously, 164 pounds is quite lean. These men had heart disease. They were not necessarily obese, so they weren't tremendously obese to begin with, but you can see they did lose weight eating ad lib low-fat diet. A couple people are particularly notable. This number 3 and number 9 are actually the two heaviest men to begin with. Number 3 lost 53 pounds in 3 months, eating 5.8% of his calories as fat. 10, 11, and 12 are interesting because they started off doing the low fat thing and they lost weight. But then by the end of the year, they had returned to swampland with over 30% of calories as fat, and they all had significant weight regain. They were actually the only people in the study with significant weight regain. So, we want to test this, and there's one great recent experiment led by Kevin Hall that does exactly that. You can see Kevin Hall's the first author there. This is the effect of a plant-based low-fat diet versus an animal-based ketogenic diet on ad lib energy intake. And this is exactly the study that we want. You can see in the low-carb diet, 10% of calories are from carbs, 75% of calories are from fat. And in the low-fat diet, those things are exactly reversed. 10% of calories from fat, 75% from carbs. So this is a true low-carb versus a true low-fat diet. And this diet absolutely was ketogenic. You can see that it produced substantial ketones. The saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats are presumably done in this way to mimic the kind of standard Western diet. Obviously, this is more polyunsaturated fat than I would like to see in this experiment, and that might have some effect on the results. Okay, so if we jump right to the bottom line, who lost more fat mass? And the answer is the people eating ad lib on the potato hack low-fat diet. You can see this is maybe 1.5 pounds of actual fat mass was lost by people on that diet. The low-carb diet was sort of flat for the first week, and then it starts to decline. The downside of this experiment is the diets only went on for 14 days. So we don't have a lot of long-term data, but they collected a ton of really useful short-term data, as you're going to see. And what happens in this diet is people are chosen at random, and they do 2 weeks of one diet first, and then they switch to 2 weeks of the other diet. And they collected all the data on the people involved in the diet in both arms of the trial. So one thing I hear a lot of people saying who are on a ketogenic diet is that when they try to add carbs back into their diet, it dysregulates their appetite. If we think about this in terms of Denise Minger's diagram there, what they're talking about is they're coming from a keto perspective. They're eating most of their calories as fat. From that context, when you start adding in carbohydrates, what you're doing is you're pushing yourself towards the swampland, right? And so what they're saying is, okay, well, I've been doing all this keto. I'm adding back these carbs. Now you're getting into swampland. Now your appetite is dysregulated. But what this study shows is that carbohydrates in general do not dysregulate your appetite. In fact, just the opposite. You can see energy intake over the 14 days. You can see that on average, people consume 500 or 600 calories more on the ketogenic diet. The very high carbohydrate diet, people naturally reduced their caloric intake. And this is kind of a weird chart over here. These lines connect the individuals. And so you can see that literally every individual consumed less calories on the high carb, low fat diet than they did on the high fat ketogenic diet. Of course, one of the rationales for low carb diets is they reduce insulin signaling. And this study did a great job. They look at postprandial insulin curves. And so you can see, in fact, so these are people on the low-fat diet. They're eating tons and tons of carbohydrates. And you can see immediately when they eat, you have this big spike in insulin that comes back down to baseline within about 4 hours. Conversely, people on the low-carb diet do not have a huge insulin spike from the meal. When you look at fasting insulin in the morning, So at baseline, everyone was at 11.3, but after the low carb diet, or interestingly, the low fat diet, both groups of people had significant reductions in their fasting insulin levels. And so it actually, in terms of overall insulin exposure, both diets did very well at reducing insulin exposure, and they both reduced fasting blood glucose by a pretty similar amount. They took all the blood measurements, even a bunch more that I'm not going to show in this. You can see all the different triglycerides, cholesterols, blah, blah, blah. I've put stars next to the winners. So you can see I have 3 stars for low carb. They actually had, so if you look at triglycerides, triglycerides were lowered in the low carb and they were actually raised in the low fat diet. So, in this line, I gave the win to the low carb diet. If you look at cholesterol, it was significantly reduced in the low fat diet, but not in the low carb diet. So I gave the star to the low fat diet there. What is very interesting in this table and is very important, and we're going to focus on for the rest of the video, are the free fatty acids. So these are the fats that are released by your adipose tissues, by your fat tissues, and those are fats that circulate around in your blood, and they are available for your cells to take up and use as fuel at any moment. And you can see at baseline, that number was 328. Insulin suppresses the release of free fatty acids. And so on the low carb diet, you see this, more than doubling of free fatty acids from a fasting state, which is real interesting. But what was more surprising, I thought, is on the low fat diet, there's also a significant increase in free fatty acids, not nearly so much as in the low carb diet. And that might be due to the lowered fasting insulin levels in the low fat diet. Insulin is not suppressing lipolysis so much. So one thing I've been talking a lot about recently is elevated branched chain amino acids. So elevated branched chain amino acids are an indicator of insulin resistance. And you can see on the low carb diet compared to the baseline before people started the diet, all of the branched chain amino acids are significantly increased on the low carb ketogenic diet. Conversely, they're all lowered on the low fat, high carbohydrate diet. So on this one, I gave the low fat diet a gold star. This to me is a very impressive result, and this suggests that the low fat diet is really increasing insulin sensitivity. In this first video, I want to talk about what is the magic that drives the potato hack and the keto hack, and I'm going to apologize. This video is a little bit sciencey. People don't come to the Fire in a Bottle channel for me to, give you skin deep analysis, right? We dig into the science here. I think that if you watch enough of these videos, you'll start to follow along. And I think ultimately, if you take the time and think about these things, your understanding will increase. So I'm kind of sorry, not sorry, that I'm hitting you with a lot of science here. So the problem, or one of the major problems with obese humans, is that we are actually not good at burning glucose. And so this, I've talked about this experiment a lot. What's happening in this experiment is you've got a group of lean humans, and these are the open circles, and you have a group of obese humans or overweight humans. And what happens in this experiment is at time 0 here, they start eating bagels, and then they consume this glucose drink. They consume something like 1,200 calories of essentially pure glucose over about an hour and a half. So immediately, the lean humans, upon eating these bagels, they're burning the carbohydrate that they consume, whereas the obese people, they lag. At the half an hour time, they haven't increased their glucose burning at all. You can see the area under the curve is significantly less for the obese humans compared to the lean humans. The lean humans are simply better at burning carbohydrates. So we can say that obese humans lack metabolic flexibility. They're bad at burning glucose. They are stuck burning more fat compared to their lean counterparts. And so why can't obese humans burn glucose? And for that, you have to look at the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is, of course, how we burn all of our food, how we burn all of our fuels to produce ATP that the body needs to run. If you look at the top of the Krebs cycle, glucose has to go through this enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase to become acetyl-CoA to get burned in the Krebs cycle. If we look at how this enzyme works, a lot of enzymes are inhibited by the products that they create. And that makes sense because the enzyme, if the enzyme is producing a lot of acetyl-CoA, for instance, and the mitochondria is already full of acetyl-CoA, then there's really not any need to make more acetyl-CoA at the moment. Pyruvate dehydrogenase converts pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and in the process, it converts NAD plus to NADH. And so both NADH and acetyl-CoA will block the activity of pyruvate dehydrogenase. Conversely, insulin is trying to activate pyruvate dehydrogenase through something called pyruvate dehydrogenase phosphatase. So when those obese humans eat that glucose, eat those bagels, insulin starts signaling and it starts trying to activate this pyruvate dehydrogenase, and then whether or not that works is going to be determined by how insulin sensitive are they. What are their circulating levels of branched chain amino acids? What are the mitochondrial levels of NADH and acetyl-CoA? Those are the things that determine how quickly those obese humans can start to burn those incoming carbohydrates. And this is super important. So this is an old saying taught to medical students. I like to quote it. The saying was, fat burns in the flame of carbohydrate. And the reason that I like this, the reason that I talk about it is that carbohydrates and fat have very different effects on the NAD plus levels of cells. We need NAD plus to run our metabolism. Burning carbohydrates increases NAD plus levels, and burning fat reduces NAD plus levels. And so this burning of glucose and fat is controlled by something called the Randall cycle. What the Randall cycle shows us is that these free fatty acids in the bloodstream are brought into cells by a protein called CD36. This LCFA means long chain fatty acids. So the fats come in through CD36 and they're transported into the mitochondria by an enzyme called CPT1. And when fat gets into the mitochondria, it gets broken down by a process called beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA is just a little 2-carbon. It's like a little mini micro fat. That's what goes into the Krebs cycle. That's what we oxidize to make ATP. And so on a very low level, most of our fuel in the body is acetyl-CoA, right? But when acetyl-CoA levels get high, it blocks pyruvate. And pyruvate is how we burn glucose. What the Randall cycle says, if you're burning a lot of fat, it inhibits the burning of glucose. The faster the fat comes in, the higher free fatty acids are in the bloodstream, the higher CD36 levels are, the faster fat pours into the mitochondria. That creates a lot of acetyl-CoA, which inhibits the burning of glucose. And here's just a little drawing of that. This is how the cell looks. Here's the fat in the bloodstream. The CD36 takes it into the cell, and from there, CPT1 takes it into the mitochondria where it can enter, where it goes through pyruvate dehydrogenase and can enter the Krebs cycle. And so this paper shows the levels of circulating free fatty acids in healthy controls is around 2,000. These are patients with fatty liver disease. So in lean patients with fatty liver disease, those free fatty acids go from 2,000 up to 2,400. In overweight patients with NAFLD, it's about the same, but in obese patients with NAFLD, that number goes all the way up to 2,700. And so what you see is as NAFLD increases, as obesity increases, you see steadily increasing levels of free fatty acids. And so, like I say, due to the Randall cycle, the higher your free fatty acids go, the less able you are to burn glucose. This is another study. They're looking at, in this case, they're looking at, again, people with fatty liver disease. But what you can see is that in patients patients have significantly higher free fatty acids. They have more fat available in the blood for cells to take up. And look at the difference in this particular study with CD36 levels in the liver. They're 12-fold higher. So you have tons of fat available, and you have tons of this protein that is pulling the fat into the liver cells. This one, this is looking at NAFLD again, and you can see the more CD36 there is, the higher the liver fat percentage. And yes, this patient has 90% of their liver is composed of fat. Obviously, they're making a lot of CD36, and they are just sucking all of that fat into their liver. This is in patients with chronic hepatitis C, and you can see the more fat, the more CD36 these people have, the higher their plasma insulin goes. The more insulin resistant they are, HOMA-IR is a measure of insulin resistance, and the higher the BMI that they have. All of these cases are increasing the rate that fat is going to be entering the mitochondria, and they're all going to be inhibiting the burning of glucose. So that brings us back to the Kevin Hall study, the low carb versus the low fat diet study that we've been talking about. And what you can see here is that, and I'm not bringing this up to bang on the low carb diet. We're going to talk about why the low carb diet works in a bit, but this is a beautiful demonstration of this principle. You can see on the low carb diet, people have significantly higher baseline free fatty acids, right? And so they're not going to be able to efficiently burn glucose. That would be our prediction. Also, and so what happened here is at time 0, they take an oral glucose tolerance test. And so they suck down a liquid glucose solution. And then over the next 3 hours, they measure free fatty acids and blood glucose. Also insulin, although the insulin was not that much different between the two groups after the oral glucose. However, the people on the low carb diet are much more insulin resistant, and people who are supporters of the ketogenic diet would say they're glucose sparing, right? They haven't been eating any glucose, so of course they're not particularly set up to use glucose. This all makes sense. I'm not saying it's pathology or it's bad in this context. But you can see free fatty acids are high. They're more insulin resistant. So free fatty acids are suppressed by insulin, but they never go down to the levels of people on the low fat diet. And therefore, the people on the ketogenic diet are quite glucose resistant, right? Because the Randall cycle says the higher free fatty acids are, the more fat is floating out there, the less you're going to be able to burn glucose. The people on the low fat diet that can clear free fatty acids within 2 hours after the meal are able to burn that blood glucose. This is kind of the last piece of the puzzle. So this is looking at mitochondrial NAD plus to NADH ratios. Again, these are the people eating bagels and then drinking a glucose drink. And these graphs are showing us mitochondrial NAD plus to NADH ratio. And as this number goes up, that means you have more NAD plus available. NAD plus, and you'll see this in the next slide, limits the rate at which your metabolism can go. And so as the lean people start to burn that glucose, you can see NAD plus availability rises. The obese people, the same thing is true, but there's a lag. And of course, it never goes nearly as high as the lean humans. And here's those two tables that I showed you just stacked upon each other at the same time frame. The lean people start to burn the glucose from the bagels within a half an hour, and their NAD plus levels already rise. The obese humans have not started to burn the glucose in those bagels after a half an hour, and so they don't have any rise in NAD plus. By an hour, they have started to burn that glucose. NAD plus levels rise. So here's what I'm arguing is the potato hack magic. Insulin lowers free fatty acids, and insulin activates pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. If you do those things, you'll be able to burn glucose. If you can burn glucose, you will increase the NAD plus to NADH ratio in your mitochondria. If you go back and watch my video, the redox case for carbs in under 10 minutes, you will learn the magic of how it is that pyruvate dehydrogenase increases NAD plus levels. And this again is the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. And so every molecule of acetyl-CoA that comes in, and like I say, acetyl-CoA comes both from glucose and it comes from fat, it comes from ketones, it comes from alcohol. And to effectively burn the acetyl-CoA for energy, you need an NAD plus here, you need an NAD plus here, and you need an NAD plus here. So as those humans are burning those bagels, they're increasing NAD plus. This causes the circle to go around faster. And if you look at dozens of studies done in the 80s and 90s, and since then, you can see that consumption of carbohydrates increases your metabolic rate postprandially. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that by burning that glucose, you're creating more NAD plus, and that is allowing your metabolism to roll forward. And I think that this is the magic of the potato hack. So that's one end of Denise Minger's scale. Now we're on the other end. We're going to look at the keto magic. This is bacon magic. And this is indeed a whole different kind of magic. They couldn't be more opposite. I think you'll see that. So the first question is, what is ketogenesis? Why do we do it? What causes it? Why does reducing carbohydrates cause ketogenesis? And I feel like with all the talk about ketosis, this is not brought up that often. This paper is a 1982 paper, and they point out that Leninger in 1946, Leninger happens to be the guy who wrote my biochemistry textbook that I used at Cornell. So that's cool. He proposed that the availability of oxaloacetate for citrate synthase represents the major regulatory factor in ketogenesis. You probably don't know what that means, but we're going to explain it. They do a bunch of experiments, and their data strongly supports this classical view that ketogenesis is essentially controlled by oxaloacetate concentration. Okay, but let's step through how this ketosis works. So ketosis activates PPAR alpha, and PPAR alpha upregulates CD36 and CPT1, which are those enzymes we saw that are importing fat into the cell and then into the mitochondria, especially in the liver. Here's that drawing I did again. You can see the PPAR alpha increasing the two transport enzymes, and these fats are getting mainlined into the mitochondria. Beta oxidation, beta oxidation is the process of breaking down fats into those acetyl-CoA groups that then enter the Krebs cycle to be burned for ATP. And this is the cycle of beta oxidation. And so at this step of beta oxidation, we convert NAD plus to NADH. We also, at this step, this is another energy creation step. So NADH is used to create ATP. The other thing that can be used to create ATP is FADH2. And so at one step, we're getting energy out of this process. At this step, these electrons go right into the electron transport chain to get made into ATP. The NAD and the NADH is sort of this floating buffer of electrons. So NADH has the extra electrons coming in from the fat, and the ratio of NADH to NAD plus can rise within the cell. The faster that you're burning all of these fats, the more NAD plus is getting converted to NADH, and that builds up. Pretty simple. This table is from that paper talking about oxaloacetate being the limiting factor in ketosis. What they do is they extract rat liver cells, and they give them different amount of oleate, which is oleic acid, which is essentially olive oil. And you can see that the more fat that they give the cells, the higher total ketone production goes. Beta hydroxybutyrate is the most common ketone. It's probably the one that your ketone meter reads. It's the one that most people have heard of. Acetoacetate is kind of the other ketone. And what you can see is that at low levels of ketone body production, they're both going up. And then once you get to a higher level of fat in these cells, beta hydroxybutyrate continues to rise and acetoacetate starts to drop. And what is extraordinarily interesting about the ratio of here we go, beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate is that converting acetoacetate to beta hydroxybutyrate requires an NADH, and it gives you an NAD plus back. As NADH levels in cells rise, more acetoacetate is converted to beta hydroxybutyrate. This winds up being a really interesting trick because this ratio tells us how reduced the NAD pool in the mitochondria is. It tells us how much NAD plus we have available to run the TCA cycle. Now, this is from the Kevin Hall paper again. And it just so happens they actually report acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate levels between the low carb and the low fat diet. In my opinion, they're not doing this to show us mitochondrial redox balance. They're just doing it to try to be thorough because those are two types of ketones that can be produced. Again, the more NADH there is, the more BHB there is. So if your goal is to have a lot of NAD plus, you want a low number. When you compare these two things, what you see is that on this low carb ketogenic diet, it's definitely working. Beta hydroxybutyrate goes from 0.089 at baseline to 2, so that's an increase of more than 20-fold in overall ketone production. But what also happens is the ratio of beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate goes from 2.5 to 4.7. That's a near doubling of the ratio of NADH to NAD+. And so that low carb ketogenic diet is lowering NAD+ availability for sure. The low fat diet, as I said, if you can burn more glucose, you produce more NAD+, and as you can see, that ratio goes down. And in fact, the difference between the beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate ratio between the low fat and the low carb diet is more than 2 to 1. And so the ketogenic diet increases the NADH levels relative to NAD+. And the low-fat diet does exactly the opposite. And so that's why I was saying these are very different magics when you look at what's happening to the redox state of the mitochondria. When you look at the availability of NAD+, very different things are happening on these two diets. Okay, now we're up to step 3. As I was saying before, the reason that we make ketones is that we run out of oxaloacetate. And what happens is when NAD plus goes up, oxaloacetate gets converted to malate, and we'll see why. This is the reason that happens. So again, here we are in the Krebs cycle again. As I've said, we need NAD plus here. We need NAD plus here. We need NAD plus here. We need NAD plus to convert malate to oxaloacetate. The fact that we're breaking down all of this fat into acetyl-CoA groups because PPAR alpha is shoveling fat into the mitochondria means that there's not much NAD plus available, right? We can't do this conversion. We've run out of NAD plus to do that conversion. And so oxaloacetate levels are going to go down and malate levels are going to go up because we simply can't do this conversion with high NADH levels. This is from that paper talking about oxaloacetate limitation produces ketones. And you can see the more fat that they give the cells, the higher malate levels go. They go from 750 all the way up to over 1500. So malate levels double. Conversely, oxaloacetate levels go from 1.9 down to 0.4. And so you see that as NADH levels are increasing, indeed, the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle is getting stuck at malate. It's not advancing to oxaloacetate, and oxaloacetate is becoming a limiting factor, right? And so why is the lack of oxaloacetate such a problem? Well, if we look again at the top of the Krebs cycle, here's what is required to use the TCA cycle to generate ATP. Fat is being broken down into acetyl-CoA for the acetyl-CoA to get oxidized in the Krebs cycle, it has to combine with oxaloacetate to become citrate. Now, if you're consuming carbohydrates, they get converted to pyruvate, and that pyruvate can be used to create oxaloacetate. But if there's no pyruvate in your diet, or if there's no glucose in your diet, you can't get any pyruvate. So, fat is coming in as acetyl-CoA, and it's going around the cycle, and it's getting stuck here, and it's not getting converted to oxaloacetate. So the next acetyl-CoA that comes in, it's just hanging out. It's got nowhere to go, right? The acetyl-CoA needs oxaloacetate to get burned in the Krebs cycle. And if there's no oxaloacetate, you simply can't burn the acetyl-CoA. Furthermore, and this is going to explain a lot about ketosis and how it all works, oxaloacetate can also be used for gluconeogenesis, and that means making blood glucose. Not only is the high NADH to NAD plus ratio inhibiting the conversion of malate to oxaloacetate in the liver is going to prioritize gluconeogenesis because the liver needs to make some blood sugar because you're not consuming glucose, right? And so the oxaloacetate that's there is going to get shunted into gluconeogenesis. And so that is also going to decrease the oxaloacetate level in the liver. And those acetyl-CoA groups are going to keep piling up because, again, if there's no oxaloacetate, they can't become citrate and go around the cycle. And people talk about how if they eat too much protein, too many amino acids, they come out of ketosis, right? If you eat too much protein, you won't be in ketosis. And that is because all of these amino acids can feed into the TCA cycle and they can become oxaloacetate. And so either protein or glucose as pyruvate can replenish the oxaloacetate pool. But if you're on a high fat, reasonable protein, very low carb diet, you are just simply not going to have a ton of oxaloacetate, and you cannot use acetyl-CoA to run Krebs in liver mitochondria. And so the final thing that happens is that the acetyl-CoA gets dumped as ketones by the liver. I showed this graph before talking about the ratio of acetoacetate to beta hydroxybutyrate and why that tells us the NADH to NAD plus ratio in the mitochondria. But this is ketone synthesis. As you can see, it starts with 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA. They come down here. They pick up some electrons from NADH on their way to becoming beta hydroxybutyrate, which, as you saw in the previous graph, is the vast majority of ketones released into the bloodstream are this beta hydroxybutyrate. And so you're essentially, the liver is flooded with acetyl-CoA and NADH. Those are the things that are inhibiting pyruvate dehydrogenase. And it packs up 2 of these acetyl-CoAs and 1 of these NADH, and it makes beta hydroxybutyrate, and it dumps it into the bloodstream to reduce all of this reductive stress. Okay, so that's all prologue. Here is the actual magic. This is how we do de novo lipogenesis, and that means making new fat. And what happens is, in the process of de novo lipogenesis, we need pyruvate to be continuously replenishing oxaloacetate so that we can combine acetyl-CoA and oxaloacetate to make citrate. And that citrate is exported from the mitochondria to do DNL. And of course, we just learned that being in ketosis limits oxaloacetate. And if you limit oxaloacetate, you cannot produce enough citrate to do de novo lipogenesis. Now, this is a cool trick because what happens is fat becomes a one-way street. That PPAR alpha is funneling fat into the mitochondria. That mitochondria is breaking it down into acetyl-CoA and NADH, and then it's just offloading it on the rest of the body as these ketones. There's no way to make those ketones back into fat because there's no oxaloacetate. And so this is essentially a hack that causes fat metabolism to run in one direction, right? The liver is just taking up fat at a very fast rate, and it's being forced to produce these ketones. It's dumping it on the body, and none of the cells can convert those ketones back into fat again. So once the liver does this conversion process, that's it. It's never coming back as fat. And I think that is ultimately the magic of ketosis, and why in some people it can cause incredible fat loss. Now, here's the second part of the trick. I don't have the slide, but in mouse studies, it's been shown that mice in ketosis have very low levels of lipogenic gene expression. And the reason for that, presumably, is that insulin is part of the process which activates SREBP1C. And SREBP1C is the sort of master lipogenic enzyme transcription factor. So it turns on all the lipogenic enzymes. In turn, SREBP1C is actually inhibited by NAD plus availability, which turns on SIRT1, which deactivates SREBP1C, and it's inhibited by AMP kinase. So just because you have insulin signaling does not mean that you'll have elevated SREBP1C and elevated enzymes involved in DNL, but lack of insulin may mean that you will tend to have low expression of DNL enzymes, and that is what we see in mouse models of a ketogenic diet. And so you have this two-way street with a ketogenic diet where you are limiting DNL, you're limiting the starting materials for DNL, and you're limiting the production of the enzymes that are involved in de novo lipogenesis. Okay, that was a lot of science. Again, sorry, not sorry, but I'm just going to step through again the two separate magics. And next week, we're going to dig way under the hood and look at some of the long-term effects on fat composition and ketogenic diets. I'm excited about that video, but right now we're going to stick on the two magics. The potato hack magic is this. If you are eating a diet that 75% of your calories are coming from carbohydrates and another 15% of your calories are coming from protein, you are going to have maximal postprandial, that means after the meal, insulin production. You're going to get a big spike of insulin. That insulin is going to activate the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. And the way that it's going to do that is by suppressing lipolysis and by lowering the amount of free fatty acids in the blood. It's going to switch that Randall cycle from fat burning over and give you the ability to burn some glucose. Additionally, it is going to use pyruvate dehydrogenase phosphatase to directly activate the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. The pyruvate dehydrogenase complex itself increases NAD plus availability in the mitochondria. It increases the NAD plus to NADH ratio. And when that happens, you go into thermogenesis. You have the ability to increase your metabolic rate because of all that NAD plus availability. And as I showed you on that previous slide, every molecule of acetyl-CoA that you burn requires 3 molecules of NAD plus. So the ability to efficiently burn glucose, the ability to have an active pyruvate dehydrogenase, absolutely is thermogenic. It absolutely increases your metabolic rate. It absolutely increases your body temperature. And in that slide, I said that fat burns in the flame of carbohydrate. The reason for that is that fat puts tremendous pressure on that NADH to NAD plus ratio. But if you can burn enough carbohydrate and bring in some fat along with it, which is what ultimately happens because you never go up to 100% carbohydrate burning, right? So in those people that are getting 90% of their calories as carbohydrates, they're mostly burning those carbohydrates, but they're also burning fat along with those carbohydrates. And obviously they don't have a lot of fat coming in with their diet. And so they're using that activated pyruvate dehydrogenase. They're using that supply of NAD plus to burn those fats that inevitably get sucked into the mitochondria along with the carbohydrate from their diet. And so that carbohydrate, the insulin signaling, pyruvate dehydrogenase becomes the lever that they can use to burn their stored body fat. Keto magic, very different magic. The keto magic, you are burning fat. That is what you're doing. The NADH to NAD plus ratio increases dramatically. You are glucose resistant. You are insulin resistant. On the other hand, the lack of pyruvate means that you cannot produce enough oxaloacetate to do de novo lipogenesis. This starves your pathways to make DNL. When your free fatty acids rise, and the Kevin Hall paper showed significantly elevated free fatty acids in ketosis versus the low carb diet. In that state, you will have maximally activated PPAR alpha. PPAR alpha increases CD36 and it increases CPT1 and it increases the flow of fat from your bloodstream into your mitochondria. This is a problem if you live in the swampland. This is going to increase NADH to NAD plus ratio, and it's going to slow down your metabolic rate. And if you live in swampland, you're going to have enough pyruvate coming in that you're going to be able to do de novo lipogenesis. And since your liver is burning a lot of fat, your liver is going to be full of both NADH and acetyl-CoA, which means it can make tons of citrate, and you can do tons of de novo lipogenesis, starting with fat and carbohydrates. But once you get rid of the carbohydrates, the fact that your liver is full of acetyl-CoA and NADH isn't such a problem because you don't have enough oxaloacetate to make citrate, which means you can't do de novo lipogenesis. And so instead, that excess of acetyl-CoA and NADH is flared off as ketones and dumped for the rest of the body. A thought that I've been having over the last week, and this is just me riffing on an idea, is that perhaps we know that burning fat directly causes this issue with NADH to NAD plus ratios. Perhaps in the event of the liver making ketones, maybe, just maybe, the liver is kind of taking that NADH hit so that your other cells don't have to. I need to think about that more. I'm just riffing there. I don't know. It's a thought that I've been having though, because the ketones are less reduced ultimately than our long chain fats, and that happens in the beta oxidation process. It's called oxidation because we're adding oxygen to the fat, and that means that the fat is becoming oxidized. And so, yes, I believe the essential trick in the keto magic is that you turn fat metabolism into this one-way street. The liver can suck up all this fat, break it down into acetyl groups, and fire it off as ketones, and the cells can take those ketones up and use them, but nobody can make fat again. And so as long as your calories are reasonable, you're going to be burning through a ton of fat that way. Okay. I hope that wasn't too obtuse. I know that was very sciencey. You know, if we don't get through the science here at Fire in a Bottle, who's going to get through it, right? And I think this stuff is important for you guys to understand. And I like to think it's not that hard. Maybe it is that hard. I'm not sure, but I know that all of these topics are revolving around NADH plus to NADH ratios, acetyl-CoA, de novo lipogenesis, insulin. These are the very things that are controlling our metabolic rate. And the more we understand about them and how these processes work, I think the more we can all think about the problem and what should we eat and what should we do with supplements in a more accurate way. Information is power, right? And so I'd like to think that in a nutshell, this video kind of sums up the difference between the two magics that happened at either end of the spectrum and the problems that happen in the middle, as well as I was explaining on that last slide, in the problems of swampland. That is to say, next week is probably going to be sciencey again, because I really want to dig into some of these studies, some of the long-term changes that we see in ketosis, some of the effects that the two different diets have on your underlying metabolic systems and your metabolism, and things like D6D and the desaturase enzymes that of course I talk about all the time, but there was just too much material to get to this week. So stay tuned for that. I think that is going to be super interesting, and we're going to keep digging into these topics. Currently, I am doing a potato hack style diet, so I'm thinking a lot about the benefits of that, but I'm not trying to throw ketosis under the bus. It's helped a lot of people. It's helped me in the past. And I'm just trying to give you guys the basic science of how these two very different systems work, in my opinion. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Come back next week. It's going to be a lot of fun.